So David Moyes finally gets recognised as a good manager. In case you didn't hear, West Ham recently won the Europa Conference League, just the second ever European trophy for West Ham United. And it's mad to think what a journey, what a story it has been for David Moyes. Over 20 years of management, ups and downs, highs and lows, and it's mad to think that when he became manager of West Ham United, most people, most fans, most West Ham fans wanted him gone. And there's many reasons for it, and there's many reasons that people did not want David Moyes as manager of West Ham United, but the rise of West Ham under his managementship has been nothing short of remarkable. And to win a European trophy, you had said that back when David Moyes was appointed as manager for his second spell, you would have been laughed at. People would have thought you're crazy. West Ham fans would have kicked you down the stairs. They would have kicked you off the bus. Literally nobody ever would have believed that West Ham would win a European trophy under David Moyes. It nearly sounds like it's too good to be true, but it's not, because it happened. And you feel like nobody deserves this more than a man like David Moyes. This is a man who spends so much time at Everton, and the main focus during his time in charge of Everton, 7+ years, the main focus was always with Everton was to get them competing, get them into the top 10, get them to challenge with the big boys. And to think that David Moyes would be lifting a European trophy after a couple of years after being sacked by Sunderland, being vilified as a manager who Premier League days were over. He was being talked about as a manager who should maybe go down to the Championship, maybe manage over in Scotland. There was not much talk about him becoming a Premier League manager. But of course, not long after that, he becomes West Ham United manager. And what's mad is he was there only for a brief period of time. He was brought in November 2017. And by May 2018, he left the club shortly after. He had the second worst win percentage of any West Ham manager in the history of the football club. Of course, he was replaced by Manuel Pellegrini as the club looked to take a more modernised approach in terms of playing a more attractive brand of football. As the club looked to, appeal to sponsors, the club looked to get into Europe, the club looked to progress and move beyond that. And it's mad to think they got rid of the man there and then who would eventually go on and lead them to European success. Crazy. And the crazy thing all about this is that West Ham was a club very much in turmoil when David Moyes came in during a second spell. Fans had grew tired of the ownership. Some of the signings in the Pellegrini era were just very extravagant. They had a lot of players on high expensive wages who weren't pulling their weight. And it just felt like West Ham were a club ultimately destined for failure. They were playing in this huge big stadium in the Olympic Stadium, a club that, if you ask most West Ham fans, they did not want to play in. They wanted to play in Upton Park. It felt like the club was trying to commercialise itself too much. It felt like it was a club that was trying to take money from its fans. It looked like a club that didn't have much ambition, that was happy to just be a mid-table, steady Premier League club. And with that, if anything, it looked like it was going to go more in the opposite direction. And I very much remember when David Moyes was initially appointed as West Ham United manager, most people believed that West Ham would be relegated in that season. And when David Moyes came in for a second spell as manager in December of 2019, it felt like desperation from the football club. It felt like the club were desperate to keep themselves in the Premier League, and ultimately they didn't really have many options available to them. They went to David Moyes, a man who knew the Premier League, knew the league inside and out, had obviously been there before at West Ham and kept them in the league previously, but it felt like it just felt like the club were almost sort of going back to something that worked before and doing it over and over again. It's a bit like when you see multiple clubs year on year go for the likes of Sam Allardyce and bring him in and try and get him to keep him in the league. It felt like West Ham were almost doing something similar. It worked. He kept them in the league. He got them to 16th position. They finished with 39 points. And ultimately, the job was successful. But even at that, in a COVID year, in empty stadiums, the fans were not happy. And going into the following season, in 2020-2021, the year again was that West Ham United would be in a relegation battle. And when you looked at West Ham in that season and some of the transfers they brought in, let's not forget West Ham had spent a lot of money under Manuel Pellegrini. They'd spent a lot of money on the likes of Felipe Anderson, players who just didn't really work. They brought in flashy type, skillful type of players. And going into this season, the air from the ownership was that West Ham were going to be a lot more conservative in how they spent money. They were going to be a lot more cautious, and they were looking to solidify themselves, I guess, as a mid-table team. Now, the fans were certainly not happy, and the general consensus was that West Ham ownership were quite lucky with the fact that the stadium, of course, was empty. There was no fans in the stadium due to COVID, meaning the fans could not protest. And a lot of fans were really not happy during that time period for multiple reasons. Transfers, players leaving, a lot of players on expensive wages, some of what the ownership had been saying about the fans, and just some of the rumblings that had been going on behind the scenes. A lot of the fans also weren't entirely happy with David Moyes staying on as manager. They felt that in some ways it lacked ambition. In some ways, it was going to set the club backwards. In some ways, the club was not going to progress because they needed someone who was going to play good, attractive football and someone with a proven track record of keeping them inside the top 10. Little did they know, David Moyes was that exact man. In that summer transfer window, you look at some of the signings they brought in, and really at the time, there was no one really who sort of caught the eye of anyone. You look at some of the signings there, Thomas Souček, Vladimir Koufal, Said Benrahma. As we very well know, 3 players who went on to be absolute revelations in this West Ham shirt, and 3 players who have very much played their part in the story of this West Ham team today. But at the time, people looked at those signings and thought, they're not inspired, they're not big names, they're not exactly what we need. And there was a general consensus that when you looked at who was in the Premier League that season, you looked at the West Ham squad that they had, relegation was a serious possibility. And when you looked at the squad in general for West Ham, it is still quite remarkable that that squad managed to finish 6th in the Premier League. Yes, they didn't even come anywhere near relegation. Mid-table mediocrity didn't even happen. They got into Europe. West Ham United got into the Europa League and would play European football the following season. And you look at the squad that was available to them that season, the squad that David Moyes had available to him. You look at the attackers, Mikel Antonio, a forward who I suppose at that moment in time people were unsure about. Could he score goals? Could he be a reliable man up front? West Ham were unsure of. Jarrod Bowen, a young player that they brought in from Hull. Was he going to be any good? Was he going to live up to the expectation? He very much did, and he also scored the winner in the Europa Conference League final, so it worked. Midfield, they had young players such as Declan Rice. Was he going to be the man in midfield? Was he going to kick them into gear? The answer was yes. He had Manuel Lanzini, Jesse Lingard, who came in from Manchester United and just absolutely tore it up, let's not forget that season. And from the goalkeeper of Lucas Fabianski to defenders such as Aaron Cresswell, West Ham United done it. They got into European football, and David Moyes showed what is possible with this West Ham side. He believed, he got the fans believing, and going into the next season, the feeling around West Ham had gone a complete 180. West Ham fans went from wanting David Moyes gone before the start of the previous season. They were still upset with the ownership, and even today there's still a lot of discrepancies with the ownership, but David Moyes had brought this football club joy. David Moyes had brought this football club to a place they hadn't been in such a long time. David Moyes had brought this football club to Europe. And when you look at David Moyes as a manager, it's always interesting because I've always felt like he's a manager who could excel in European football. Because when you look at the style that he plays with, I feel like his style is very suited to European football. It's the type of team that grinds out wins, that sits in defensively, that's tough to beat, that's well organised, that wait for breaks on the counter-attack, resolute in the way that they play. And you felt like in European football that this West Ham side would cause damage. They had a lot of very tough, physically strong players. And going into the Europa League that season, West Ham were not expected to do much, but they exceeded a lot of expectations in that season. In the league again, they finished in 7th. They missed out on the Europa League this time around, but did qualify for the Conference League. I wonder if you were to ask West Ham fans now, actually I don't think I would need to wonder. You would ask West Ham fans now, they would say, thank God we finished 7th. They had the opportunity to get into the Europa League on the final day, but lost on the final day, and instead ended up finishing in 7th because Man United failed to get a win against Crystal Palace. But the story for West Ham in that season was in Europe. The club reached the semi-finals of the Europa League They won 4 out of their 6 games in the group to win it with 13 points. In the round of 16, they sealed a famous second leg win against Europa League kings themselves, Sevilla. They beat them 2-0 in the second leg. And to think, Sevilla themselves are the club, like the Europa League is their competition. West Ham beat them in the second leg in the round of 16. Incredible. A 3-0 away win to Lyon in the second leg, another extraordinary result for West Ham that's seen them through to the semi-finals of the Europa League. Unfortunately, they lost to Eintracht Frankfurt. You do often look back and think that was a serious opportunity for West Ham, because the teams that were in the Europa League semi-finals probably weren't of the highest of standard, really, when you actually think about it. And there was an opportunity there for West Ham. Should they have got past Frankfurt, I think they would have beaten Rangers, and I think they would have won a European trophy before this one, and I think they even would have played Champions League football. Well, they would have played Champions League football had they won the Europa League. But it's just quite remarkable to see, and quite remarkable to think of how he got this club, how David Moyes got this team believing once again. And West Ham United now, we're in the Conference League, but it was a competition, in my opinion, that it suited them, because you looked at it and thought Europa League will be tough for them, but the Conference League, they can win this competition. They have a serious chance. You look at the clubs that were in it and you thought West Ham have an opportunity to win it here. And one of the most impressive things about David Moyes in this time period with West Ham was that he was bringing in experienced Premier League footballers. He wasn't looking abroad, he wasn't splashing the cash abroad, trying to make the club look fancy and bringing silky, crafty wingers. He was bringing in Craig Dawson from Watford, Kurt Zouma from Chelsea. He was establishing this team with experienced players who knew how to dig out results in the Premier League, but also in European football. And that leads us to this season, the 2022-2023 season. And for West Ham, it was a bit of a mixed season in some ways. It ended on the most extraordinary note, winning a European trophy, and ultimately that is all the season will be remembered for. But in the league, there was moments where relegation looked possible. There was moments where David Moyes looked like he was going to be in trouble. It looked like maybe the sell-by date of this side and the David Moyes management style had come possibly to its end. They were struggling in the league, they were struggling to grind out results. But towards the end of the season, they did enough. They got enough results, enough points on the board to steer them away comfortably from relegation. So it meant that European football, or qualifying for European football through the Premier League, was not going to happen. The only way it could happen would be to win the Europa Conference League outright. And it was a competition that West Ham were excelling in. It felt like a distraction from the Premier League. Players were thriving in it, and they were playing teams and everything else that West Ham would feel comfortable in beating. And in the Conference League, West Ham comfortably came through their group. They won all 6 matches with 18 points. In the knockout rounds, in the round of 16, they beat AEK Larnaca by 6-0 on aggregate, 2-0 away from home, 4-0 at home. And then in the quarterfinals, they did enough to get past Ghent, 4-1 at home in the second leg. Against AZ Alkmaar, it was certainly a game remembered for some of the craziness in the stands in the second leg, with AZ Alkmaar trying to attack some of the players' families. But West Ham United did the business on the pitch. They won 3-1 in aggregate, 1-0 in the second leg to set up the Europa Conference League final. And in that final versus Fiorentina, they just about did it. A late Jarrod Bowen goal, in the end enough to win it for West Ham. And the thing about West Ham, in my opinion, is that throughout this Conference League season, it's actually never really looked in doubt. When you look at a lot of their matches, it's not like they've gone behind, they've had to battle back from the dead, they've scored late winners. They've actually won this competition quite comfortably when you think about it. The only time they ever faced any real bit of jeopardy throughout this tournament was possibly in the final, when they'd conceded an equaliser and they were on the back foot for a brief period in time. But generally, this has been very comfortable for West Ham. And I think with David Moyes, and I think with this West Ham squad, especially after the Europa League semi-final the season previous, David Moyes proved to himself, the players proved to themselves, they have what it takes to win in European competition. They have what it takes to win this trophy, and they had the experience, and David Moyes had the management tactical nous to set the teams up right and to grind out results, and that's ultimately how they did it. And for David Moyes, he's a man that I suppose you feel sorry for in some ways, or you did feel sorry for at times in the past sort of 10-15 years. Like any big British manager, when you go into a big club, when you go into a big job, whether it be a big top 6 club in the country, the national team, you always feel like once things go wrong, you're scapegoated and you're vilified by the press, and it almost feels like there's no return. And we've seen this with multiple managers in the past. And for David Moyes, when he failed with Manchester United, having done so well for a long period of time with Everton, you looked at it and thought, how is he going to come back from this? How is he going to, get back to, I suppose, doing what he did with Everton? And he went to Real Sociedad, which was a strange move, in my opinion, to go completely abroad to Spain, a language he didn't speak, and a league that he didn't know. It was always probably going to end up one way, which was really not well. It had some good moments, some very few good moments. And then he went to Sunderland, and when things went bad at Sunderland, you just felt like, I think there's no way back for David Moyes here. You felt like the only thing for him left to do was to go manage in Scotland. Maybe he could manage in the Championship. He's done enough to establish himself at getting another Premier League job. But whether a Premier League team actually wanted him at that moment in time, it was really hard to know. And he came into West Ham in his first spell, and there were some good moments, don't get me wrong. But ultimately, I think West Ham fans were happy when Manuel Pellegrini came in, a man who'd won a Premier League title with Manchester City. It felt like completely the right move at the time. And when David Moyes came back in, there was a huge amount of trepidation amongst West Ham fans who did not want him in a job. The general public laughed at the appointment. Many fans felt like West Ham were destined for failure. And it's incredible, because there's one thing that we overlooked in all of this. David Moyes, in his time at Everton, what was he good at? Keeping the team solidified defensively. The team were very hard to beat. They were tough, they were physical, they were strong. They were always tough on the 50-50 balls, brilliant on set pieces. They relied on scraps, and they would always be a team you never liked to play. And I think we forgot about all that. We forgot about what he'd done with Everton, getting them into the top four. We forgot the fact that he got them to an FA Cup final. We forgot that he'd done so well with Everton for so long on such a small budget. And we overlooked his good days and thought that what happened with Manchester United, what happened with Sunderland, what happened with Real Sociedad was ultimately the curtain raiser of this man's career. But what he's done is he's completely showed that it is possible to come back from the brink and do something unthinkable and win a European trophy. West Ham United became just the fourth club in England to win a European trophy since the turn of the 21st century. There might be a fifth. There might already be a fifth by the time this video is released. But you look at it and think, wow, David Moyes, incredible. And for West Ham, who knows what's going to happen next? They'll be in the Europa League next season, a competition that they went to the semi-finals of just 2 years ago. With David Moyes, you maybe felt like this maybe is the perfect way to say goodbye after what was a difficult Premier League season, but will remain to be seen what happens there. I think David Moyes has more than earned his right to stay on as West Ham manager. And, if he wants to stay on next season, I think the job is his. And look, he's proven he knows what to do in Europe. And who knows? The David Moyes race is far from ran. David Moyes finally gets the recognition he deserves as a manager. It's great to see. Like and subscribe. I'll speak to you later.